You're listening to episode 73 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Nancy Waring joins us to speak about Lesley University's Mindfulness Master's Degree Program. As mindfulness becomes more mainstream, the call for accreditation is likewise increasing. Accredited programs for mindfulness, however, are few and far between. There are some, however, which offer a rich blend of teaching, science, and practice in an academic setting. Mindfulness Studies program founder Nancy Waring encourages students to get to know their own minds. A long-time mindfulness meditator and mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, she is among a growing number of educators focused on contemplative studies. Besides mentoring students in contemplative subject areas, she designed and teaches the interdisciplinary graduate course Mindfulness and Professional Practice. Nancy has a particular interest in the effects of meditation on the brain and studies of neuroscience of meditation. Nancy's career has spanned academia and journalism. She has been a writer, editor, and writing teacher for 30 years. She served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Bulletin and deputy executive director of Hippocrates, a primary care journal for physicians. Formerly a frequent contributor to Boston Sunday Globe magazine, Nancy has also written for The Village Voice, Natural Health, Women in Crime, and Shambhala Sun magazine. In 1994, she helped found a home in Cambridge for formerly homeless women with HIV/AIDS, where she facilitates a weekly support group. She has received several awards recognizing her work, including the Cambridge Peace Commission's Peace and Justice Award. Our guest today is Dr. Nancy Waring. Nancy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted.
Very glad to have you here with us, and let's start by asking you to tell us a bit about your background.
Well, I think I can tell you a little bit about my academic background and my introduction to mindfulness at the same time because they're somewhat connected. I got a PhD in Victorian literature from Cornell in the mid-'80s, the early '80s, I guess, and I returned to Cambridge, Massachusetts, uncertain about my direction. Did I want to continue to teach Victorian literature? Did I want to get a job in a university? Did I want to be a writer? I really wasn't quite sure, much as I loved the Victorian period. I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in the 19th century. So I had a friend in graduate school whose sister lived in Cambridge and was a therapist. And she said, maybe you would benefit by talking to my sister. So I set up an appointment with my friend's sister, and her name was Trudy Goodman.
It's a familiar name to several listeners of the podcast.
I had no idea about mindfulness or anything related to it. I was not schooled in Buddhism at all. But I went to see Trudy, and she said, I think you would really benefit from taking a course with this friend of mine whose name is John Kabat-Zinn, whom I had never heard of either. This was probably might have even been before I finished my dissertation and a little earlier than 1985. So John Kabat-Zinn had already started the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic in 1979, about which I knew nothing and I hadn't ever heard of it. But he was also teaching meditation and yoga in a little place in Watertown, Massachusetts called Interface, which was a wonderful little place where a number of a little bit off the map courses were taught back in those days. So I took that course and was introduced to mindfulness the way John teaches it and was quite astonished by what it seemed to offer me in terms of more calm, more clarity of mind. I don't think more insight at the time. And I stuck with it for a while, the practice after the course, and then I kind of dropped off. And I decided at some point that I would see about pursuing a job in journalism. And actually, I was quite fortunate because I had no experience in journalism, but I did get a job at a law magazine and I freelanced on the side. And I did a lot of writing for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine. And I, at some point during that period when I was a stringer at the magazine, I persuaded my editor that it would be really wonderful to do a piece on this thing. I didn't really quite understand it, although I was trying to practice it, called mindfulness. And I was given a green light to go forward. And so I decided to do the piece on John's program at the Center for Mindfulness, on Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, the non-residential retreat center in Cambridge, the urban meditation center, and Insight Meditation Society in Barrie. So I took John's program as a journalist. However, I had benefited from it tremendously personally. And I started interviewing Larry Rosenberg and Narayan, at the time, Levis and Grady, at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. So I had the opportunity to ask all these teachers a whole lot of questions about what this thing called mindfulness really was that I was trying to wrap my mind around, and attend John's course and spend a little time out at Insight Meditation Society as a practitioner cum journalist. So it was at that time, after I had the opportunity to inquire more into what mindfulness was all about, that it really began to take. And at that point, I started taking the beginner's course in Vipassana at Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. Probably took it 3 or 4 times and took a bunch of other courses. And gradually, Narayan emerged as my guiding teacher in a wonderfully organic way. And she highly recommended, in fact, admonished me to start doing retreats at IMS. So I started doing retreats at IMS and became a really serious practitioner. And around that time also joined a group that Narayan ran regularly called Old Yogis, which was for experienced practitioners, meaning folks who had been practicing for at least 3 years. And I'm still in that group today. And the Sangha has shifted a bit over the years. And our name is no longer Old Yogis because some of us are actually getting old. So Narayan has changed our name to Experienced Practitioners.
I was going to say experienced might be a more gentle term to use.
Well, also because the center, of course, wants to encourage young people. So there are a bunch of gray hairs and, long in the tooth folks and some young folks as well, which is really delightful. So that was, I would say, the beginning of my practice, an introduction to mindfulness.
A wonderful, rich history, and with so many names that listeners to the podcast are very familiar with, of course. And that led you in some fashion to create one of the first, if not the first, mindfulness studies program in the US at a university level. How did that idea first come about?
Well, it did not spring fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. It was.
That's who I pictured.
It came to me actually in bits and pieces, and it came to me initially as an idea about a course I wanted to teach. And here's how it came about. I had the opportunity. I had a journalist pass again to the first stateside symposium dialogue between the Dalai Lama and meditation adepts and neuroscientists at MIT in 2003. And that, you may remember or may know, was put on by Mind and Life.
Mind Life Institute. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Mind and Life Institute. And the Institute had been, its members, its leadership had been meeting with the Dalai Lama for a number of years in Dharamsala and arranged for the first time in 2003 to have a meeting at MIT. So I was there and I was quite astonished by what I heard. For example, I heard some Tibetan adepts talk about being able to visualize very large numbers of deities in a single sitting, one after another, one after another, one after another. And the neuroscientists sat there and said, well, that's simply not possible. The human mind cannot do that. So that was a very interesting situation. And I think the symposium lasted for 2 or 3 days. And in the course of it, it occurred to me, gee, I really need to create an academic course in mindfulness, or an academic course that in some way draws from the richness of what I've experienced and place it in an academic context. And at the time, I was a professor at Lesley University in a program called Interdisciplinary Studies that allowed students to develop their own programs of study with faculty oversight. And they could take courses, they could create independent studies, they could do all kinds of interesting things that are quite unusual in a more conventional master's degree program. So I developed a course and I submitted it to the curriculum committee and I started to offer it, and it became very popular. And I'd be happy to say a little bit about the course, but the short version of the story about the mindfulness studies program is that course went very well and was popular. And then I got an idea for another course based on training I had done in insight dialogue, Gregory Kramer's work. And I'd be happy to tell you a little bit about that too in the first foundational course if you'd like. But so it went.
So it sounds like there's been a steady growth and adding on of new components to make this more robust as time went on.
Thank you. That's exactly, in fact, how it happened. By about 2011, I felt we were prepared to launch a advanced graduate certificate in mindfulness studies that was at the time 12 credits. We still have that certificate program now. It's 15 credits and includes a 7-day silent retreat, just as our 36 credit master's degree program does. And then there was a number of students in interdisciplinary studies who had been so interested in the mindfulness courses that I had developed by that time that they wanted to specialize in mindfulness studies, which I had proposed as a possibility and which was accepted by the academic leadership. So we had a specialization, and then it began to seem evident that, gee, why couldn't I ramp this program up a little bit and add some more courses and bring on some other faculty and actually have a full-scale master's degree program. So I was able to do that, and we launched the program in the summer of 2014.
So let's take just a few moments and talk about the structure of the program and what's in there before we get into some other questions about it, because I'd really like a chance to hear about what's in there. I'm sure several listeners would like to know more about that as well.
Okay, well, I can break that down as best as I can. We have a 36 credit program, and it begins with a newer version of the first course that I mentioned, which I began developing and teaching in 2004. It includes a course in which the primary practice, along with sitting meditation, is insight dialogue, in which I'm trained. And then I have trained with Gregory Kramer fairly extensively, and also with Jan Sari. So it seemed to me that it would be possible and interesting to take that relational practice and integrate it into a course that had a strong academic frame. So in order to do that, I began to think about philosophers of dialogue as communication, one of whom is David Bohm, the great 20th century physicist who actually influenced Gregory Kramer tremendously. In fact, Gregory Kramer and one of his colleagues co-wrote a dissertation on David Bohm's practice of dialogue as communication. It's called Bohm Dialogue. And I can say a little bit more about that if you'd like. But anyway, they were very much influenced by Bohm Dialogue and went on to develop this form of practice called insight dialogue. So I thought, how interesting to read David Bohm. And he has a wonderful little book called On Dialogue that is one of the texts for the course, along with a number of other texts, and a film, as a matter of fact, that invites students to think about mindfulness and right speech and mindful communication and relational mindfulness. So that was course number 2. And I didn't say anything yet about course number 1, which I'd be happy.
Please do.
Thank you. Well, the first course was, it might have been called initially Mindfulness in Professional Practice. The title today is Mindfulness, Theory, Practice, and Science. It has seemed over the years that given the upsurge in interest in contemplative neuroscience, that it would be useful to introduce students to that topic in a foundational course. So I began to think about what shape would a foundational course in mindfulness take that would be most beneficial for students and offer some in-depth practice opportunity, as well as some reading and texts that would really prompt them to think analytically and be reflective and engage in academic work and integrate that work with practice. And I was aware that there were other contemplative courses going on in which students actually practice mindfulness, but they had a separate mindfulness lab that was separate from the classroom work. And I wanted to bring practice into the classroom. I wanted to have an integrated arena in which practice and academic work, a kind of container for both of those. So that's how I set the course up. And the 2 texts that I selected were John Kabat-Zinn's recently published book, Coming to Our Senses, and Dan Siegel's book, The Mindful Brain, which was just out. At this point, we've switched to Mindsight because it's his book that he wrote that he published shortly thereafter, which I think is a little bit more accessible and a better choice for this course. But it seemed like those two texts were really wonderful companion texts. One in which John sets forth in a very narrative way many of the fundamental concepts and principles of mindfulness, and in completely secular language. Although he does refer to the Noble Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, and so on. The book is not written from a Buddhist perspective.
Right. It's a very appealing read, interestingly enough. I'm glad you brought that one up because I'm rereading it now. It's downstairs in my reading nook.
Oh, good. That's great. Yeah, it bears rereading. I mean, of course, since I teach the course again and again, I read the book again and again. And it always seems vibrant. I try to read it with beginner's mind. And I really like Dan Siegel's work on attachment theory and his model of the wheel of awareness and his case studies from his own therapy practice, in which he talks about bringing mindfulness to his patients. And so some of our students are young, some not so much, but he has case studies of one of the case studies about a 19-year-old boy who was diagnosed with bipolar illness, whom Dan, who, as you know, is a psychiatrist, as well as now a serious mindfulness practitioner and very well-known neurobiologist, introduced this young man to mindfulness in their sessions, with the very happy outcome that this young man was able to get off meds and is now doing very well, or at least he was at the end of the book. He also has a case study of a 94-year-old man who was very out of touch with his feelings and very into his left brain and very cognitively centered and not at all connected with his feelings. And he worked with this 94-year-old guy using mindfulness, and the guy's family were very, very happy with the results. Out came a much warmer, more accessible 94-year-old husband, grandfather, father, and so on.
Yeah, it's always interesting, those compelling stories that are not first-person narratives from the patient, but rather those around them. To me, that's a bit more telling.
That's a very interesting observation. That said, one of the interesting turns in this book is that Dan makes himself into a case study and describes, students love this chapter, describes an occasion on which he himself had a meltdown, in which two of his kids were disagreeing about something inconsequential and got a little scrappy about it. And Dan got annoyed, and then his annoyance escalated, and he kind of lost it and wound up, speaking too sharply and too loudly to his kids, which he greatly regretted afterwards. And what's so interesting about this case study of Dan himself is that he then describes exactly what was happening in different areas of his brain, that including, his amygdala, the center of the arousal center of the brain, and tells us exactly what was going on neurologically during the event of his meltdown, and then talks about ways in which mindfulness practice strengthens the areas of the brain that help us stay in our right mind, so to speak, and manage to, tamp down the amygdala and ramp up the middle prefrontal cortex and keep us alert and oriented around our own behaviors when we're triggered.
And were there other aspects of the program that you wanted to chat about before we go into what some of the difficulties have been in setting up the program and maintaining it?
Well, I did want to mention that I'm pretty excited about some of our new electives. We have a new elective on mindfulness in education, because we have a lot of students who are teachers and are interested in bringing mindfulness practices into their classrooms. And we also have a new elective in Qigong. Many of our students have been eager for us to have a course in mindful movement. And it occurred to me that a course in Qigong could be especially a wonderful addition rather than yoga, which might be the obvious thing, given that at least mindfulness-based stress reduction is so yoga focused, and a number of our students are actually certified yoga teachers. I thought that Qigong would be an interesting alternative, and students are absolutely loving that class. So that's one I'm very delighted to, give a nod to. So as to your question about challenges.
Yeah, what have been some of the difficulties that you've experienced in setting up the program, and maybe as it's grown over time, what are some things you've run into?
Well, that's a great question, because the initial challenges had to do with getting a buy-in from the university, and the challenge that we're all aware of, I think, that comes up so often around is mindfulness Buddhism.
Yes, that comes up a lot.
Yeah, as you well know.
Yes.
Is there a conflict? Is there an inherent conflict if a student is Muslim or a practicing Muslim or Jewish or Christian when we're teaching Buddhist thought, which we do in this program? Or even if we didn't, would there be an inherent tension? Because many people seem to think, or have the impression, that mindfulness is Buddhism. So it's difficult, of course, to tease all that apart in a coherent way in a short time frame. But that was a concern on the part of the administration. And my position was and is that we were introducing students to Buddhist thought. We were in no way trying to convince students to become Buddhists. And in fact, we well know that the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. In fact, he wasn't even the Buddha. He was Gautama. And the early teachings of the Buddha, at least in my opinion, are eminently practical and have really very little to do with religion, at least in terms of a religion that's based on theism, and have nothing to do with worship, and have to do with proposing a way of being in the world that reduces suffering and contributes to human flourishing. So it was a challenge to be persuasive on that point. And I don't know that I ever even really was persuasive on that point. It just seemed like the problem sort of went away somehow because the program was successful and the interest level was high. And it was clear that what we were doing was, ethically very sound. And our intentions were really pure insofar as what we were trying to do was encourage our students to become the, brilliant creatures that they already are.
So it sounds like it's gone well, continues to go well today. What are some of the stories that stand out for you or may stand out for you as ones that you sit back and recollect that particular situation and think, that's why we did this?
Well, I'll tell you, Ted, one thing that comes to mind immediately was an event that we held at our residency. Our program is largely online, but each year we have a week-long residency in which students are on campus taking courses that have been running during the summer. Well, the residency occurs in the middle of the summer semester usually. So students have been working asynchronously online and then come together for courses and other events at residency. And one of the events we scheduled this year that we couldn't have scheduled in any previous residency was thesis presentations. Students who had graduated in spring, our first graduates, of whom there are 3, presented on their thesis projects to the community. So there were 3 students, ages in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, who had been with me for about 3 years and who started the program taking courses before there was a bona fide program. And here they were speaking about their culminating projects and the work that they're continuing to do based on the areas of interest that developed for them over the time they were in the program and about which they wrote elegantly in their thesis projects. So it was just a really, really, really wonderful moment. So that's a standout thing for sure. And I'd say most of the big moments are really little moments with individual students when they come to me and they say, my life is really different since I've been introduced to this practice. My relationships are better. I sleep better. I'm happier. I'm paying attention to my thoughts and knowing that they're not necessarily true. Those kinds of moments that happen so frequently are just really wonderful. Or when I talk to somebody who seems like a wonderful prospect to join our faculty and teach a course, and we begin to talk about what the course might look like. It's very, very exciting.
So you list, or the website lists, several different career paths that open up with mindfulness. I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit about those.
Well, sure. Actually, I think it's important to be kind of modest on that subject and not make claims. It's not like we have a career center and students can come to the career center. And
here's your mindfulness job waiting for you.
Right. It's not like that. Although the day may come when there is a designation such as mindful CEO. John Kabat-Zinn and I have talked about that, and I think he would say that day may well be not too far away, given the fact that members of parliament in Britain are now practicing mindfulness. But we don't make any big claims. One of the things that often occurs in the program is that students come in with a direction. We get a lot of yoga teachers, for example, and a lot of people who are involved in health and wellness in one way or another. And some of them have been teaching yoga for years, and they begin to introduce mindfulness practices into their yoga. So a pre-existing career path becomes changed, becomes influenced, becomes altered in some profound way by the theory and practice of mindfulness. Some folks are entrepreneurial and they are interested in starting some kind of a health and wellness program. We have a couple of students who are doing just that and are drawing on what they've learned in the program in order to create a new program of their own. One other student actually comes to mind off the top of my head who graduated several years ago, who was a professional coach, as a matter of fact. And she was interested in integrating mindfulness into her coaching practice. And she was also, the interest that she developed in the program was in women with infertility. So she is now a consultant. She has a consulting business coaching women who are dealing with infertility using mindfulness. So students are very entrepreneurial in that way. They figure out something that they are already interested in, to which mindfulness is incredibly value added. And of course, we have a lot of teachers who want to introduce mindfulness into their classrooms and are committed to really embodying the practice, for whom either the master's degree program or the certificate are a great boon, I would say.
Speaking of teachers, could you tell us a little bit about the faculty that you have working on the program as well?
Well, sure. I would be absolutely delighted to. One of our faculty members teaches, we have a course in the Buddhist traditions, and the individual who teaches that course is Chip Harntraft, who is also the director of a center in Arlington, Mass, at which a number of mindfulness activities occur, including mindful yoga. There's a mindful movie night, and he is actually known to be one of the foremost experts on the Yoga Sutras, and he teaches the Yoga Sutras at his center in Arlington, but he's also a very advanced Buddhist scholar. So we're very fortunate to have him. And my experience with all of our wonderful adjuncts is that I've had the opportunity to persuade them to teach in the program at the outset. They said, well, gee, I'm really too busy, because everybody's too busy. And Chip Harntraft is too busy. He's a very sought after guy. He teaches at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies. He runs his own center. He writes, he practices, he has a number of interests. But when some of these folks begin to hear about the program and what's happening in the program, they begin to get really interested. And that's what happened with Chip. So he's been with us for 2 years now. Students completely love him. His course is considered quite difficult and challenging because he introduces a lot of ideas that are initially, at least, or maybe even more than initially, quite foreign and unsettling, like the idea of non-self, for example. So students love that class and are very challenged by it and work really hard in it. I would say that's one of the most rigorous academic courses. The course that I was speaking about earlier on Insight Dialogue, I thought there's nobody who is an academic who I know who is expert in Insight Dialogue. They're wonderful people who are very advanced teachers of Insight Dialogue and great practitioners. But I need somebody who's going to be able to understand how to create a course or how to revise the course that I developed that places the practice of Insight Dialogue in an academic context. So I actually put an ad in the listserv for academics of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And a brilliant person appeared who has become just a wonderful colleague. And she actually teaches the course. She's English. She lives in Sussex, England, and she teaches the course from across the pond. And she's fabulous. So that's another faculty member. She's a clinical psychologist, and it just so happens that she's a very dedicated practitioner in the Theravadan tradition. And she's very well trained in Insight Dialogue and very familiar with the theorists whose work we look at in the course. So that was a very happy event. Let's see, who else do we have? Oh, how could I not mention this person right away? Our contemplative neuroscience course was initially taught as an elective, but we decided that last year that it was time to make this course required because we really thought our students should be familiar with the work that was being done in contemplative neuroscience, the studies on the brain and effects that mindfulness appears to have on the brain, although, of course, the research is very new and most of the studies need repeating. But Wendy Hassenkamp teaches that course, and she is the senior science officer at Mind and Life. So it was wonderful that she was recommended to us by Diana Chapman Walsh, who's been a board member at Mind and Life for many years and who was the former president of Wellesley College and very central figure in the area of leadership and social change. And as a member of the board, she was very familiar with Wendy Hassenkamp and Wendy's work, and she recommended Wendy, and Wendy actually said yes almost right away because she was thrilled at the opportunity to actually teach this material. And I believe she had taught monks in Tibet a little bit about neuroscience in the past. But she was thrilled at the opportunity to teach an academic course to graduate students. And she put together a fabulous course that's now about to be in its third year.
Wonderful. And was it Kim that you were speaking about before for the Insight Dialogue?
No. Mariana Fuchs is her name, the clinical psychologist from England who's teaching the Insight Dialogue course.
And Nancy, was there anything else that you wanted to share with the listeners about the program?
I think a really key thing that I might mention in closing is how wonderful it is to see the excitement among the students about the program. We just had our third residency last month, and the students have formed such a community. They really get to know each other at the residency, and they continue to connect online, so on Facebook and in other ways, so that although the program is online, I feel like we really have a sangha. We really have a community. And these students are just delighted by what they're discovering about themselves and each other. So I would say that the practice itself is contributing to community because the practice is so relational. So I would say that. And I would also say, and this is a somewhat connected thought, that if I had to name one word that characterized what we want to teach in this program, what we want to foster, what we want to nourish, it's compassion. So, and that's what we see developing more and more in our students toward themselves and toward each other, and which we see them taking out into the world in whatever their endeavors are as mindful citizens.
Thank you for that. And I agree. I think that's a wonderful aspect of the training is that arising of compassion or maybe just revealing a compassion that's already there. Our guest today, Nancy Waring. If you'd like to find out more about her work, I'll be linking to the Lesley University program and also some of the books that were mentioned in today's conversation. Nancy, thank you so much for being here.
Ted, thank you so much. It was really a delight to have this opportunity to talk to you and to think about your very thoughtful questions and to talk with you during this time.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.